Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive with us. We love to take a closer look at all kinds of history, but today we're doing something a little bit
A
different.
little different, yeah.
We're heading into the Vietnam War, but not in the way you might immediately think.
Yeah, we're going beyond the typical combat stories,
Yeah,
the ones that tend to dominate the narrative.
exactly, and we're going to uncover the experiences of women during that time.
It's a side of the war that so often gets overlooked.
Definitely. So to guide us on this deep dive, we have Kristin Hannah's novel, The Women.
Yes, an incredibly powerful story, and we also have a YouTube review discussing it, which adds another layer to our analysis.
Awesome. I think it'll be really interesting to see how these sources, not just tell us what these women did during the war, but also, the societal pressures they faced back home.
Oh, absolutely, and the lasting impact of their service on their lives.
Right, like how they were treated when they returned.
Exactly. It's a complex picture, but one that deserves our attention.
For sure. Okay, so the novel, it centers around Frankie McGrath.
Frankie, yes.
She's a young woman from a well-off family in California and a nursing student.
hmm
And right from the start, you see her grappling with this idea that women can be heroes too.
That's such a key quote from the book.
I think so too. I mean, that must have been a radical thought in the 1960s, right?
Oh, absolutely. You have to remember, this is a time when traditional gender roles were so deeply ingrained. Women were expected to be wives, mothers,
Okay,
homemakers.
the whole, barefoot and pregnant kind of thing.
Exactly. But Frankie, she comes from this family with a strong military tradition. Her father even has a hero wall
Mm.
dedicated to all the men in their family who
The
served.
hero wall. Wow.
Yeah, it's a big deal in their family. And for Frankie, the idea of heroism is tied to military service.
Okay, I see. So it creates this internal conflict for her.
Exactly. She's torn between these societal expectations and her own desire to be seen as a hero, just like the men in her family.
And then she makes this seemingly impulsive decision to enlist in the Army Nurse Corps.
She follows her brother to Vietnam.
So is it just impulsive or is there more to it?
I'd say it's not just impulsive, no. It's rooted in this deep desire to prove herself, to break free from those societal constraints. And the reaction from her parents, despite their patriotic background, it speaks volumes.
Oh, how so?
They're horrified. It really
Yeah.
highlights the prevailing attitude of the time. Supporting the war was one thing.
Yeah.
But for a woman to actually go to Vietnam,
Yeah, to actively participate in such a dangerous way.
exactly. It was just stepping way outside the norm.
That's a powerful point. And then, of course, Frankie's sheltered life in California is completely shattered when she arrives in Vietnam. I mean, the sources really don't hold back in depicting the brutality of the war.
Not at all. It's raw and unflinching.
Yeah, it's not just the constant threat of attack, but, the sheer number of horrific injuries she has to treat as an army nurse.
It's overwhelming.
Absolutely. One of the reviewers even talked about how Hannah really brings that sensory experience to life, the vivid descriptions of the sights, smells, and sounds of the battlefield.
It's true. The writing is so visceral. It really puts you right there in the thick of it with Frankie.
Like you can almost smell the antiseptic and feel the heat and hear the chaos all around you.
Exactly. And I think it forces you to confront the reality of what Frankie and countless others went through.
And it's not just the physical toll, it's the emotional one too, right?
Oh, absolutely. Frankie's constantly surrounded by death and suffering. She sees young soldiers, some even younger than her brother, dying in her arms.
It's hard to even imagine how she begins to process that kind of trauma.
It's almost impossible. And that's where we see the importance of those human connections, even in the midst of such horror.
So true.
Frankie forms these incredibly strong bonds with her fellow nurses Barb and Ethel.
Right, I remember them.
They become her lifeline, her support system in this chaotic and terrifying world.
It just goes to show that even in the darkest of times, those human connections can provide a glimmer of hope and strength.
Absolutely. They're essential for survival, both physically and emotionally.
And these friendships, I imagine they become even more critical when we consider what awaits Frankie upon her return home.
Oh, definitely, because it's not the hero's welcome she might have envisioned.
No, not at all. In fact, it seems like the opposite.
It is, she faces a society that's trying to forget the war ever happened.
And in doing so, they erase the contributions of those who served, especially women.
Exactly. It's like a double betrayal. First, the trauma of the war itself, and then coming home to a country that doesn't want to hear about it.
And doesn't want to acknowledge what she and others went through.
It's heartbreaking, really, Frankie. Like so many other female veterans, is told time and time again there were no women in Vietnam.
It's like they're trying to rewrite history, erase her presence entirely.
It's a form of gaslighting. And it has a devastating impact on Frankie's mental and emotional well-being.
It makes sense, though. Imagine being told that your experiences, your trauma, your service, it just didn't count.
It's no wonder she struggles to find her footing back in civilian life.
And it's so ironic considering her initial motivation for enlisting was to, earn her father's approval.
To get on that hero wall.
Exactly. But instead of recognition, she encounters dismissal and isolation.
It highlights those complex and often contradictory societal expectations placed upon women during that time.
So on one hand, patriotism was encouraged, but on the other, challenging gender roles was met with resistance.
That's the reality of the situation.
Frankie wanted to serve her country, be seen as a hero, but ends up feeling like she did something wrong.
Like she should be ashamed.
And then on top of all of that, she's dealing with the invisible wounds of war.
The sources are clear about that.
Frankie is suffering from PTSD, haunted by nightmares, flashbacks, and just this constant sense of unease.
PTSD was not well understood back then, especially for women,
There was so much stigma around mental health.
and very few resources for veterans, particularly women.
Right. One reviewer pointed out that, male veterans at least had the VA,
Some support.
but women were often denied those same benefits.
It's like they were being punished twice. First, for serving in a way that challenged norms, and then again by being denied the care they so desperately needed.
It's just another stark reminder of the inequalities that women faced during that era, especially female veterans.
Their contributions were downplayed, their needs ignored.
So how does Frankie cope with all of this?
Well, that's a story for our next part.
Yeah, we'll have to dig into that more next time, but it's clear she's got a long road ahead of her.
A long and difficult one, for sure.
But I'm already so drawn into Frankie's story, and I can't wait to see what happens next.
I think our listeners will be too. It's a story that stays with you.
It makes you think about things differently.
Absolutely. And hopefully encourages us to learn more about these often forgotten experiences.
That's what we're all about.
Sharing these important stories.
Yeah. So join us next time as we continue to uncover the complexities of Frankie's journey and the broader impact of women's experiences in the Vietnam War.
We'll be right here waiting.
See you then. So we left off talking about, that societal erasure that Frankie faces when she gets back home.
It's tough to imagine going through such a harrowing experience, and then being met with silence and denial by the people you thought would support you.
It's like a slap in the face.
It's a tragic reality for a lot of veterans, but especially for women during that time.
The Vietnam War was so unpopular.
People just wanted to sweep it under the rug,
Yeah.
pretend it never happened.
And part of that meant ignoring the contributions of those who served.
Particularly women.
One source even mentioned that Frankie's repeatedly told that there were no women in Vietnam.
It's like they're trying to rewrite history,
Yeah.
erase her presence entirely.
It's almost like a form of gaslighting.
It is, and it has this devastating impact on Frankie's well-being, both mental and emotional.
I mean, just imagine being told over and over that your experiences, your trauma, your service, it all didn't matter.
Like, it didn't even happen.
It's no wonder she has trouble adjusting to civilian life.
It's a huge struggle for her.
And it's just so ironic, right? Considering her initial motivation for going to Vietnam was to earn her father's approval.
To get her picture on that hero wall.
Exactly, but instead of that recognition, she just gets dismissed and isolated.
It really shows those complex societal expectations placed on women back then.
Patriotism was fine, but challenging gender roles, that was a whole other story.
Frankie wanted to serve her country, be seen as a hero,
Yeah.
and she ends up feeling like she did something wrong.
And to make matters even worse, she's also dealing with the invisible wounds of war.
The sources don't shy away from that.
It's clear Frankie is suffering from PTSD, haunted by nightmares, flashbacks, just this constant sense of anxiety.
PTSD was not well understood back then.
Especially not for women.
There was such a stigma attached to mental health,
And almost no resources available for veterans.
especially female veterans.
It was like they were being punished for serving in a way that challenged norms and then punished again by being denied the care they needed.
It's a really stark reminder of the inequalities women faced, especially female veterans.
Their needs were ignored.
Their experiences minimized.
So how does Frankie deal with all of this? How does she cope with this isolation and the trauma?
Well, she turns to some unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Why?
Alcohol, drugs, anything to numb the pain, escape the memories.
It's a classic response to trauma, isn't it?
Sadly, it is, but it just leads to a downward spiral.
She pushes people away, sabotages relationships. It's like she's lost in a maze of her own trauma.
Unable to find her way out.
And on top of that, she's still dealing with those societal pressures.
Trying to be the good girl while grappling with these complex emotions.
One reviewer mentioned that the book felt a little like a soap opera at times,
Oh, really? In what way?
especially in its portrayal of Frankie's romantic relationship.
It's an interesting observation. While their romantic elements might be a bit heightened, I think they reflect Frankie's search for connection.
Like she's trying to fill a void.
Exactly. The void left by the war, the loss of innocence, the lack of recognition from society.
But even those relationships are pretty messy, aren't they?
They are, and ultimately they don't bring her the satisfaction she's seeking.
It just highlights her inner turmoil and the fact that she's having trouble forming healthy attachments.
The book really doesn't shy away from showing how trauma can affect relationships.
Frankie's journey is a reminder that healing isn't a straight line.
It's messy and painful.
So we've seen the tough realities of Frankie's return home, the denial of her service, the lack of support for her PTSD, her struggles with addiction.
It's a difficult story to digest.
What brings Frankie back from the brink? How does she even begin to heal from all of this?
Well, that's the question we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive. But before we do, I want you to think about something. The contrast between Frankie's expectations of heroism and the reality she faces when she returns home.
Yeah, how does that dissonance speak to the larger societal issues surrounding the Vietnam War and the treatment of veterans?
Especially women veterans.
That's a really good question.
We'll dig into that next time.
Can't wait. Okay, so we've been through a lot with Frankie's story, right? The war, the homecoming, the struggles.
It's been heavy.
Definitely. But now I'm really curious to see, like, how does she find healing after all of that?
Yeah, after the trauma and the erasure and everything, it's not a quick fix, you know.
It seems like an impossible task almost.
The sources make it clear that it takes time. Frankie spends years trying to bury it all, pretend everything is fine, but it just keeps coming back.
The pain.
Yeah, the nightmares, the flashbacks,
Yeah.
the self-destructive behavior. It's like the trauma's demanding to be acknowledged.
Like you can't just ignore it and hope it'll go away.
Exactly. It doesn't work that way.
So what changes for Frankie? How does she start to confront all of this?
Well, a big turning point comes when she connects with other Vietnam veterans.
Oh, interesting.
But not nurses. It's soldiers who've seen combat.
Okay, that seems kind of counterintuitive at first, right? Like their experiences were so different from hers.
You'd think so, but there's this shared understanding of war. You know? Things that only someone who was there could know.
The unspoken stuff.
Exactly. And it creates this really powerful bond between them.
I can see that. It's not about comparing traumas, but just having a space where you don't have to explain your
Or
pain.
your pain is just understood.
And for Frankie, being around these veterans finally allows her to break the silence.
She starts talking about what happened to her, the things she saw, the guilt and anger she's carrying around.
Sharing those burdens must be such a relief.
Oh, it's huge. That act of sharing is a crucial step in her healing journey.
It's a reminder of how important community is, finding your tribe, especially after something as isolating as war.
Absolutely. And it's not just about finding comfort in shared experiences. These connections help Frankie challenge those societal messages that have been holding her back.
Oh, you mean the whole idea that her service wasn't as valuable because she wasn't on the front lines?
Exactly. She starts to push back against that.
To define her own sense of heroism.
Yes, and it's powerful to see.
So she's reclaiming her narrative.
She is. And as she does that, she starts to find ways to channel her pain into something positive.
How so?
She uses her skills as a nurse, her understanding of trauma, to help other people who are struggling.
Wow. So her experience in Vietnam, the thing that caused her so much pain, actually becomes a source of healing for herself and others.
That's a beautiful example of post-traumatic growth.
She doesn't let the trauma define her.
Nope. She uses it to make a difference in the world.
It's interesting how healing isn't about forgetting the past, but finding a way to integrate it into your present and future.
That's a great way to put it. And for Frankie, part of that integration is accepting that society might never fully understand her sacrifices.
But that doesn't change what she went through.
Nope. It's about finding validation from within, not seeking it from a world that's still struggling to get it.
It's a powerful message of resilience.
And self-acceptance.
And that brings us back to the title, The Women. It's a reminder that Frankie's story isn't unique.
There were so many women who served in Vietnam whose contributions we never hear about.
The novel lets us glimpse into their world and challenges us to think about what could have been different.
Right. What if they had received the recognition and support they deserved? How would their lives have been different?
It's a question worth pondering.
It makes you examine your own biases and how we perpetuate these harmful narratives about gender and war.
This deep dive has been quite a journey. We've covered a lot. The war, the trauma, the the resilience.
And the often untold stories of the women who served in Vietnam.
Their bravery and their sacrifices shouldn't be forgotten.
And by learning about their experiences, by truly listening to their voices, we gain a better understanding of history and of ourselves.
And hopefully we can create a world that's more just for everyone who has served their country.
That's the goal.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Until next time.